We have two people on our question list. I'm going to start with Calvin Wu says, thank you for the presentations. My question is for John. Did the early Soviet work of Bukharin et al. On Marxist ecology make any headway or impact in Britain? I'm wondering whether J.D. Bernal or J.B.S. Haldane have also contributed to Marxist ecology. And then the second question, I invite Joe Ramsey to unmute himself and to read it out loud, word for word.
Okay, thank you, Kira. Thanks everyone for your presentations. Let's see. So I wrote in the chat box that I would like to hear Marcelo share a sample of a formulation or two as to how Marx himself expressed the idea of communism in some of these lesser known works, and perhaps highlighting what seems significantly different from some of the, in my view, quite inspiring formulations we already have, however inadequate they might be, such as from each according to ability to each according to need, a society where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And I'd also welcome John Bellamy Foster to speak to how ecology may intersect with those notions of communism. Thank you.
All right, let's start off with those two questions and then we'll go to the next one. John, would you like to take it away?
Okay, well, the first question on the influence of the early Soviet ecologists on Marxists in Britain. This is something that I dealt with at great length as part of my book, The Return of Nature. So the answer can be found there in great detail. But basically, it was in 1931, there was a second international conference on the history of science and technology in London. And they had invited a Soviet participant to that conference, and Stephen Chinsky, and but they didn't think anybody was going to come from the Soviet Union. In fact, Stalin was prohibiting it until the last moment. And well, the conference was starting, or it was the day before. It was just beginning, and a plane arrived from the Soviet Union and landed in London, which was intercontinental flights were very rare then. And out came Nikolai Bukharin and Stevinsky and Vavilov and a lot of the Boris Hessen, a lot of the leading ecological scientists in the Soviet Union. And so the British scientists like Joseph Needham and J.B.S. Haldane and J.D. Bernal and others were all involved in this conference, and they connected with the Russian visitors, and they quickly translated everything like overnight. They even manufactured a book in like 2 or 3 days, and they had these Russian presentations, and it threw the British socialist scientists, it bowled them over. They had a new viewpoint, and really an ecological viewpoint, a more dialectical viewpoint on science, and a new history and sociology of science provided by Boris Hessen. And it's out of this that the British Marxist ecological tradition developed, really. It's under the influence of these thinkers, who then they went back to the Soviet Union, and they were almost all executed within a few years. So but in Britain, they carried on in that tradition. And it was quite distinct from what was going on in the Soviet Union itself, although they had connections there. But they were developing a genuine exploration of dialectical materialism and nature. And this is being carried out by some of the leading scientists in Britain. And they developed all sorts of ecological views. So yeah, the influence was there. And I think that in Britain, you had this sort of second foundation of Marxism, which then carried over to scientists in the United States and still is important. And remember, in the 1970s, as I said, it was sort of taken for granted that Marxism was ecological. It was only in the 1980s that turned around. I mean, when E.P. Thompson gave his great speech on the Notes on Exterminism, his great pronouncement on that, he said, you know, the answer was the ecological imperative. That's what would guide the resistance. That was common at the time in 1980, but by the late 1980s, it came to be the view that Marxism had always been opposed to ecology and Promethean, which contradicted all of this. And of course, the contributions of the scientists had been forgotten because Marxism had declared that it had nothing to do with science. And many of them, if you look at a figure like Perry Anderson said that Marxism really had never had anything to do with natural science, which wasn't true, wasn't accurate, but people believed it and they stopped looking. So yeah, there was this tradition in Britain. It had its faults, it had its contradictions, but it's very, very important in terms of understanding both the development of ecology and our own practice today.
I would like to go back to the question asked by Joe Ramsey and read a couple of quotations first and then try to answer to what is the difference, what is the main difference. Let me first start by saying that the quotation, the passages, let's say the definition of communism by Marx that I will read are all related to his writings written when he had already studied for a long time the critique of political economy. And I will be clearer later. So when we read Capital, for me, the most essential quotation is that communism is an association of free individuals working with the means of production held in common and expanding their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. But these quotations are even expanded in the preparatory manuscript, for example, the one published between 63 and 67, when Marx spoke of the passages from the capitalist mode of production to the mode of production of associated labor. And in the critique of the Coda program, there is a connection with that later. He defined the social organization based on common ownership of the means of production as a cooperative society. So in this manuscript, what do we find? We find a more detailed explanation of what Marx wrote very quickly, sometimes in a couple of words or a couple of lines in Capital, when Marx is talking about the fact that the ruling principle of the agri-formal society will be the full and free development of free individual, as I mentioned before. This is something that we can find in many places, and in my chapter there is a long list to this. For me, the main difference between this and the texts that I read or the Communist Manifesto is the fact that Marx provided these definitions and this analysis when he had a deeper understanding of socio-economic analysis, when Marx had a deeper understanding of capitalism, and also when Marx had done at the end of his life more political experience as a leader of the International or just observing the Paris Commune at very late the Russian populist movement in Russia. And if I can anticipate something that is asked by Babak Amini in the chat, and I guess that John Bellamy Foster will respond to this, but the question about the associate mode of production, if the associate mode of production is an ecological mode of production, then Kira will read the question in a better way. I just want to anticipate this. I think there is a lot related to planned economy. So perhaps the ecological element can be taken also from that point of view, and to the fact that that society is not a society that leaves everything to the market, to the presupposed self-regulation of the market, then in the end, as we see, destroy the society, not only socially, but also ecologically. So that's all for me for now.
All right, thank you very much. Despite the interruptions in the chat, we actually have 4 more questions to pose to the speakers. I'd like to start off with first a question from one of our co-producers, Sren Mudliar, who says, if we posit that Marx was not a Promethean thinker, what are the standards by which he would have been measured, leaving the earth better, cited by Marcello, for successive generations? This question is posed to both John and Marcello. And then the second question comes from Babaka Mini. Would Marxist conception of communism as an associated mode of production be logically ecological? Is there a necessary logical link between Marx's conception of communism and his ecological understanding? In other words, is quote, associated mode of production, end quote, one and the same as an ecological associated mode of production? And I believe this is directed at both speakers.
Well,
I will leave it to you, right? Yeah.
Shall I answer the first one? If the question is, we posit that Marx wasn't a Promethean thinker, what are we, what measure do we take him by? The Promethean terminology, the notion of somebody being a Promethean thinker was largely introduced to attack Marx and no other thinker. Basically, only Marx was characterized as Promethean. And it's very important, and it seemed to fit, because everybody's seen the pictures of Marx depicted in his early days as Prometheus. And of course, when he wrote his doctoral dissertation, he had praised Epicurus as a Promethean figure, and he praised Prometheus based on Aeschylus's play, where Prometheus was actually a revolutionary figure. There were 2 traditions in terms of the notion of Promethean, of Prometheus and Promethean. Up until the 19th century, almost all references to Prometheus had to do with the being the giver of light. And from that came the notion of enlightenment, which Voltaire introduced, but he really took it from Lucretius, Epicurus's follower Lucretius. And Epicurus and Lucretius were often seen as, Marx called Epicurus the Enlightenment figure of antiquity and in the German ideology. And Epicurus was seen as a figure who combated religion and provided a materialist view. And so he was associated with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment meant bringing light. It meant bringing wisdom, and it's a metaphor for that. But in the 19th century, the metaphor got changed. I mean, the metaphor got changed. I mean, you can see it all through the 18th century. It all means one thing. In the 19th century, the earliest that I know of is Mary Shelley and Proudhon started to use Promethean to mean machinery, to mean mechanism, to mean industrialism. And that's what it's come to mean today, but it's completely removed from what Marx was referring to when he referred to Prometheus. So this got all very confused. And there was attacks on Marx for being Promethean, and by which it was meant that he was an advocate of extreme industrialism as the object of society. And those who made that charge never really could provide any evidence of it. I mean, obviously, Marx believed in industrial development, so did everyone else in the 19th century. Even the Romantic poets, they believed in it to some extent, but Marx never believed in mechanism or industrialism as the object of society. He even in The Poverty of Philosophy, he even criticizes Proudhon for that. So it was a charge, and it was particularly Ted Benton made it quite famous in his Marxism and Natural Limits that Marx was Promethean, and people swallowed that. And so we systematically went through. There's just no evidence of that whatsoever. And there's evidence of Marx having a deep ecological view. Where does ecology come from? Where it came from a materialist understanding of nature in the first place. Is very and Marx picked that up, and he adopted the concept of metabolism, for example, which is still the basis of our ecological perspective. We talk about the earth metabolism, right? In order to understand the climate problem, we talk about the carbon metabolism. It's all based on the same systems perspective. So Marx had a really deep ecological view. The word ecology was not used in his day. It's true, Haeckel coined it, but it wasn't really used until the 20th century. But they did use the notion of metabolism, and Marx was the leader in introducing that into the social realm. So there's it's a profound ecological thing. I don't know what we would say he's measured by. I think it's enough to say that this is a dialectic that involves both the materialist conception of nature and the materialist conception of history. So it's fundamentally ecological in the substantive sense. And there's a lot of literature on this. There are people who've gone into it in depth. Besides my own work, there's people like Koei Saito, there's people like Ian Angus, who's used this analysis to deal with the problem of the Anthropocene and the climate problem. There's just innumerable people have building on this. So I guess if I wanted to give a label to it, I would say it's Marxist.
Thank you, John. Marcello, do you want to take the second half?
No, I'm fine with everything that John said, and there is not very much to add. And the second question was about the one of Babacamini, right? Was about the associated mode of production. And I tried to respond already before in relation to what Joseph Ramsey asked me. So mentioning the question of planned economy. I don't know if John wants to add anything else about this, or we can go ahead with the other questions.
I'd like to add something. Is in Marx, in his most developed definition of socialism in volume 3 of Capital, says that socialism is the rational, this is very close to his words, but it's a paraphrase, rational regulation by the associated producers of the metabolism between human beings and nature, so as to promote their own development while conserving energy. But this is he's defining socialism as the rational regulation of the metabolism between human beings and nature, and by the associated producers. And of course, the metabolism between human beings and nature is production for Marx. And it was, as the question asked, was this the same? Was this the associated mode of production the same as the ecological perspective? Yes, I think the answer is yes, it was. And there's a great article by Paul Burkett that appeared in Month Review. I forget when, I think it was like 2005, called Marx's Vision on Sustainable Human Development. And it provides a very, very coherent view of Marx's notion of associated mode of production and its relation to ecology and sustainable human development. They're all wrapped up together for Marx.
All right, thank you both very much. So we have 3 last questions if we have time for all 3. I'll start first with Paul Zaramka. If you'd like to unmute and read your question out loud. All right, if he's not available to read the question out loud, I'll just say what he wrote. Marcello, regarding your mentioning of the need to pay great attention to personal freedom, I would like to point out the current among too much of the left to support, even enthusiastically, vaccine mandates, thereby denying their freedoms and ignoring in the process alternatives like early treatments against COVID-19. I wonder what your thoughts on this problem related to personal freedom are. And the next one is from Peter Fay. Peter, would you like to unmute and read your question out loud? All right. After 50 years as a Marxist, I found the most reliable differentiator of leftists and revolutionaries is the interpretation of dictatorship of the proletariat. How can leftists reject Marx's words to Weidemeyer, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, yet still call themselves Marxists? Are we reliving Euro-communism? And I'll throw those to Marcello first.
Yes, thanks, Kira. So very briefly on both questions, I believe that one thing in the many debates that we had in the past 2 years during the pandemic, one thing is questioning the permanent state of exception that many governments impose on society, and there were many debates in Italy, in particular with Agamben, for example, that were popular and disseminated abroad. Another thing is advocating against vaccine and considering that I don't know, not doing the vaccine is an example of freedom. So I don't agree with the Zaremka on this point, and I will not take this as I don't know, an important characteristic that the left should embrace. The second question, the dictatorship of the proletariat, there is a famous study published by Monthly Review on this concept, and this indicated that Marx and Engels use both of them the expression dictatorship of the proletariat not only in things that they publish, but in private letters, including the famous one to Weidemeyer mentioned here, written in 1852, only 12 times. On the contrary, this concept has been widely used by many Marxists hundreds of times, if not thousands of times in the 20th century. So I think that there is an overcharacterization of this, and as Hal Draper, who is the scholar that I mentioned before without mentioning your name, indicated, sometimes there is also a misunderstanding of what Marx meant with this. And I don't think that the critique of dictatorship of the proletariat, of this idea, associating this to socialism, means reviving Euro-communism or social democracy. Thanks.
Well, in terms of the first question, I don't want to get into the vaccine issue specifically, although I want to note that in the United States, we've reached 1 million deaths this last week. And I do think that there is a relationship between personal freedom and social freedom. The Marxist approach focuses on social freedom, which doesn't negate individual freedom, but it has to, there's a dialectical relation between the two. And we have to be aware of safeguarding society as a whole. So it's a complex question. When does an individual action endanger the much larger population? So in some states in the United States where there's a protest against vaccination, the mortality rate is much higher, and there are a lot of innocent victims. So in terms of the second question, dictatorship of the proletariat, I sometimes think that when it comes to terminology, oftentimes because Marx said something, the term becomes negative. It changes its meaning because of all of the polemics and the Cold War propaganda and so on. Dictatorship in classical terms meant a situation of temporary kind of emergency rule that in a transition, an emergency. And that's what it meant in ancient Rome, and that's the sense in which they used it. But the term dictatorship, its meaning changed in the 20th century. It came to mean something quite different than what it had originally meant. And so we have to watch the changes in language. We have to look at, well, what did it mean when they used the term the dictatorship of the proletariat? Everybody knows that they saw the present society was a class dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The dictatorship of the proletariat was an emergency situation, though, where in a transition where the proletariat would rule the society, like in the Paris Commune. But the object was to get beyond that, to get beyond any form of class rule. So if you understand it the way Marx and Engels wrote about it, the historical antecedents and so on, there's no problem. But the propaganda wants to give to their meaning a quite different meaning that was product of the 20th century and carries on into our own century. So we either look at this intelligently with historical understanding, or we don't.
Thank you, John. Marcello, do you want to, I see you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to make a comment?
No. I responded before John this time, no?
Yeah. All right, then. We have two more questions on the docket, and it seems we have just another one that's popped up. First off comes from Mauricio Vieira Martins. To Marcello, in your exposition, you emphasize that Marx was also concerned with the freedom of different individuals. Considering this, what is your opinion on the widespread use of the concept of Marxist egalitarianism to define Marxist thinking? Does this concept do justice to the complexity of texts, such as the critique of the Gotha program? And also, congratulations on the initiation of this important debate. And then I'd like to invite Michael Novich to unmute and ask his question. He has messaged me to say he can no longer unmute.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I joined late, but I'm curious if the speakers would say something about Marx's view about expropriation as well as exploitation in defining the nature of capitalism, particularly in terms of the question of land and rent and its its role within capitalist economics. Thank you.
Switching it up, Marcello, the first question was pointed to you, if you'd like to take that.
Yes, you also mentioned that there was a third one. Should we do all together because we are?
I will admit a fourth one just came in as well. So the third one comes from Babak Amini and is posted in the chat. He writes, I was wondering if there were new or unique developments in Marxist thinking on ecology, communism in his late years, late 1870s until his death, particularly in relation to the possibility of non-linear historical developments and non-Western societies. Do we need a different, perhaps broader concept of rational planning in post-capitalism in the light of the late years of Marx? Is it all right if we stick to these three questions and we get to the last question in a bit?
Yeah.
You want to go first, John?
Okay, well, in terms of the first question on Marxist egalitarianism, I basically agree with István Mészáros in his Beyond Capital that the fundamental Marxist view, and this includes Marx, obviously, but goes back even as far as Babeuf, is one of substantive equality. The Marxism is not an argument for formal equality, which is the way we generally know equality, and formal equality has inequality built into it. But it's rather, Marxism is based on the notion of substantive equality. So in terms of, it goes further in terms of egalitarianism than any other viewpoint. And in fact, I often say that socialism in our time is really, comes down to substantive equality, the struggle for substantive equality and ecological sustainability. So I don't think you can go further than that. And Mészáros, when he was developing the notion of substantive equality, did it primarily in the context of women and Marx and Engels's writings on women. And it's really a very powerful discussion. So if you're interested in that, I would say go to that particular source, Mészáros's Beyond Capital, and read what he had to say about substantive equality and women. In terms of the expropriation question, this has been a problem for Marxist theory. People got entranced by the notion of primitive accumulation, that concept supposedly in Marx, and they got all tangled up in it. They like the term primitive accumulation, so it's used over and over again. It seems to not be noticed that Marx said over and over again, so-called primitive accumulation. He did use the term primitive accumulation, but he prefaced it. He headed the section, so-called primitive accumulation. He repeated that. He repeated it in the final chapter of Capital. He says, so-called primitive accumulation. Why did he say that? It wasn't over the word primitive. He was taking the notion of he was involved in a critique of what Adam Smith called original stock standing for accumulation. Where did the original stock come from? And then when it was when Marx wrote Capital, and it was translated back into English, it was mistranslated as, instead of original or primary accumulation, or so-called original or primary accumulation, it was mistranslated as primitive, which created all sorts of confusion. But what Marx was complaining about when he said so-called primitive accumulation, or when he said so-called original accumulation or primary accumulation, what he was complaining about was the notion that it was accumulation at all. And if you look at the text, if you look all the chapters in that section of Capital, he's not taught, the term he uses most often, the term he uses to explain what was going on was expropriation. The land was being expropriated from the commons were being expropriated from the peasants, but it's all about expropriation. Expropriation of land, but it's also about expropriation of bodies, because slavery and bonded labor and all of that comes into the discussion. So he's focusing on expropriation. What's that? It's robbery, right? And that's really crucial. It wasn't accumulation. Accumulation is the savings and investment process, as we say. And accumulation is what capital does. This is not what's accumulation. It was expropriation as a basis of capital. And that's been lost. That concept got lost in most of the treatments of what's called primitive accumulation. So that became a real problem. Now, what is expropriation? Expropriation is appropriation without an equivalent. And Marx also used the term appropriation without exchange, because for him, exchange didn't occur. Appropriation, he would say appropriation without exchange. Well, he would use expropriation. For him, for Marx, you couldn't have unequal exchange. If it was exchange, it meant there were equivalents exchanged. And so he didn't use the term unequal exchange. He used notions of appropriation without exchange, expropriation without equivalent. Pliny used the term appropriation without reciprocity. And this is what expropriation is. And it provides the condition under which exploitation can take place. But expropriation is always renewed in order to renew the conditions of exploitation. And this is something that we developed and understood in Marx's Ecology. I deal with it with Brett Clark in The Robbery of Nature, and Hannah Holloman and Brett Clark and I have written about this, about Marx and expropriation. Yeah, in the Robbery of Nature is dealt with in detail, and others others have been dealing with this in terms of social reproduction theory, bringing in the concept of expropriation, and it's also being used in the racial capitalism theory, and it's increasingly understood. You have people like Peter Lindquist who deal with this. It's increasingly understood that you have to have a dialectic of, you have to understand in terms of the dialectic of expropriation and exploitation, that they are interrelated perpetually within capitalism, and that was Marx's view. I hope that helps.
I will then focus on the other questions. Kira, may I? And John is also having problems with the light. I hope that it works now. So, Mauricio, very interesting question. And I think it is useful for me to cover one point that I had to omit at the beginning of my presentation. So to talk a little bit about this form of pre-Marxian socialism, called utopian socialist. I don't like this expression, or early socialist perhaps better. This is also good to see how significant was Marx's contribution in his critique to capitalism. Usually we quote Babeuf, Cabet, this idea of primordial socialism, but I would like to read a couple of quotations from very important people and revolutionary at the time. One is Theodor Desami, and another one, perhaps more known, is Weitling. Desami wrote the Community Code in 1842. So this is just a few years before the Communist Manifesto. And I would like to read this because he spoke of a world, quoting, divided into commons as equal, regular, and united as possible, in which there will be a single kitchen, one common dormitory for all children. The whole citizenry will live as a family in one single house. So there is this idea of radical equality that is also strong in the other author that I wanted to mention, Weitling, Wilhelm Weitling, in the book Humanity as It Is and as It Should Be, published in 1838. So foresaw the elimination of private property, and he believed that this will automatically put an end to egoism, and simplistically regarded the main course of our social problems. I write in my book, quotations, in this eyes, the community of gods will be the means to redemption of humanity, transforming the earth into paradise and immediately bringing about enormous abundance. What is, in my opinion, the problem with this ultra-egalitarian primordial socialism? Well, all the thinkers who projected such a vision had committed the dual error. First of all, they took it from granted that the adoption of a new social model based on this strict conception of the quality, very different from the one that John has mentioned at the beginning, that this could be the solution for all the problems of the society, eat the same, dress the same, etc. And they convinced themselves, without knowing sometimes anything at all about economic laws, that all that was necessary to achieve it was the imposition of certain measures from on high, whose effect will later be altered by the course of the economy. So this idea that we impose from the top, sometimes also with the state, this strict equality, and this will be the solution for everything. The other question, Babak, about the old Marx, I don't think that the old Marx said was strong enough to rethink this complicated question, or perhaps even to rethink, to write it down for the first time in a proper, not very fragmentary and sometimes contradictory way of planning, rational planning, etc. On the question of the non-linear historical development of Western society, of non-Western society, on the contrary, we can see some useful changes, improvement, in particular with the famous preface to the 1859 Critique of the Political Economy, when Marx is talking about these four modes of production: feudalism, Asiatic mode of production, capitalism, and socialism. So Marx is more open, right? This is what I would like to mention. Although there are some problems in some statements that we will find, that we can find in the anthropological, ethnological notebooks, and we are very much looking forward the publication of the new editions of this document forthcoming, edited by David Norman Smith for Yale University Press. Hopefully 2023 is out. But I want to mention that even there are these changes, improvement, Marx is not completely different, is not making any turn with relation to the question of capitalism and the role that capitalism had. So Marx is not turning back into, I don't know, the critique of Hertz and socialism that he was making in the 50s and in the 70s. This is not a Marx like the one represented by scholars like Enrique Dussel or many people in the 70s and the 80s who talk about third world Marxism. So the idea that revolution can be done without a central role of the working class. Thanks.
Thank you. Gosh, we're towards the end of our program and we have one last question. I'm going to invite Julian Zavalla to unmute his microphone and pose his question.
All righty. Hi. I first off just like to say thanks for everybody, Kira and Søren, that put this together, and all the speakers that dedicated their time to this. So my question, I'll read it off just from what I sent. Where does China stand with respect to the progression to socialism and then communism? Is there any reason to think that there is a meaningful meaningful progression to this end in China? Should we view China as being a useful force in the world and helping to foster the development of other nations, such as in Africa, as the USSR had done? Or is this naive? Should we perhaps only see China as useful so far as it threatens the hegemonic dominance of the United States and the West generally? Just what should we as Marxists see China as in today?
Marcello, do you want to take a stab at this question?
John first, as always, or, I can go very quickly if you want, and then I'll leave to John the final things. So I will go for the second option. I don't think that China represents what it was for some in the past, like a useful force for socialism. I see that the Chinese Communist Party, reading the document and reading also what their policy is, can be seen from many point of view more like a nationalist force than a socialist force. So I will not be inclined to have this reading of China and of the experience of China's socialism today in the 21st century.
Well, my view is a little bit more complicated, I think, because I think that China is a post-revolutionary society. I don't think it's socialist or capitalist, according to our traditional definitions. It's a society that is still in conflict and undetermined. It has elements that are socialist and elements that are capitalist, and there are really serious battles going on in China in terms of determining its future. In terms of revolutions, we can't expect them to always develop as we would like, and we have to examine the historical process. So I think there are actually some amazing things that are happening in China now, that it's going in what we could call a more socialist direction. Certainly, it's got its national project, as Marcello said, but it's still indeterminate. I am sympathetic with those in China who want to promote socialism and revolution, and that we would consider on the left. And I'm not sympathetic with those who want to turn China into a capitalist or a neoliberal economy. And so I'm really interested in the class struggle that's going on in China now, and the struggles, some of his struggles within elites too. And I'm hoping that it will go in a more progressive and a more revolutionary direction. And we just don't know exactly. It's indeterminate. But there are reasons. There are a lot of reasons today for hope. And so I guess my position on this is very similar to that of Samir Amin, who wrote quite a bit about it and really influenced Month Review's view on China. And it's very similar to the view of many of the movements in the global South. So there is hope there, but there's no certainty. There is conflict, and I'm really hoping that the socialist forces will become more and more prominent in that society. So I'm not really inclined to brand societies. I don't think that was Marx's method entirely either. I mean, he looked for the revolutionary possibilities in given societies in indeterminate situations, and I think that that's what we have to do in this case.
John, but let me ask you, that's interesting, and I share these things that you said about socialist left in China that of course we support, but how can we combine these things that we just mentioned about the centrality of ecology in the socialist project for the 21st century, the value of political freedom for socialism in light also of the big defeat that we had in the 20th century, with some of the main limitations that China is showing us in the most recent years? What would be your opinion on this, if I may continue the discussion just for one more minute, because we are close to the end?
Well, I think that in terms of the environment, China has a sort of a socialist ecological modernization strategy that it's calling ecological civilization, trying to build an ecological civilization. And it is a fact that they are doing more in response to the environment than any other country in the world. They're coming from a very low point, right? They're the biggest polluter, but they're doing way more to shift things than any other country in the world. And that's just, we have lots of evidence in that. They're the leaders in all the alternative energy. They're the leader in reforestation. They're getting their pollution down. They're doing a lot of things. The main problem is the coal burning. They've got to get rid of that. And the coal-fired plants. They're moving away from it, but not fast enough. And so this is, but at least they have ecological civilization as a project. Does the West have ecological civilization as a project? I don't think so. In terms of political freedom, of course, we get a lot of different information from the West. I have different sources of information, but I think that there are a lot of signs that political freedom is better, at least from a class standpoint, in the Xi period than it was prior to that. For example, I think that their movements against the privatization of education, their movements against corruption and so on, these things are really the shift towards raising wages. These things are even I think in terms of their return to the mass line is their version of increasing the democracy in the society. I'm not saying that I'm a follower of what's that I adhere to what the Chinese line or their society, but I do think that the changes that are occurring now are a huge improvement and a turn to the left compared to the preceding period. And whether they'll succeed, I don't know. And there are all sorts of contradictions, and it could fall apart. But I do think that the direction is better than it was, say, in 1989, and they've moved back towards a more explicit avowal of socialism, and they're also trying to create a global South alliance, which is one thing that a lot of us have wanted to see. So I'm hopeful, but uncertain, skeptical, but still hopeful. I see no reason for me to declare that China is one thing or another, but I can look at what's happening and see certain trends and possibilities that I think that as Marxists we ought to defend. So That's my view. I don't, yeah, I don't think the propaganda is that there has been a drop in political freedom under Xi. I think that's the Western view, and that's precisely because of what they're going against. Is because it's because they're actually doing some of the things they ought to be doing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yes, but we cannot continue the debate. We avoided the debate on COVID. We will continue the debate on China or other forms of socialism next time. Thank you. Thanks to Kira, to Suren, to Michael. It was wonderful. And let's celebrate once again the Marx Revival and all the wonderful books that have been mentioned in this talk and also in the chat. Thanks to John Bellamy Foster. It was a pleasure. Thanks to all of you. And we are meeting Kira also in 2 weeks once again, right?
Yes, we have another event May 21st. I'd like to pass this over to Michael, who would like to announce 2 important events. And then I just want to thank everyone for coming today and bearing with us for the somewhat strange interruptions in the chat. And I'd also like to say that, you know, we couldn't have had this discussion without you all. Michael, if you'd like to mention.
Excuse me. The very thing about the May 21st is our second part on this Marx Revival series. And it's rare that you will have an event with as many important speakers. Not that John and Marcello weren't great today, but we have Michael Lowy, Bob Jessup, Michael Kratky, Heather Brown, and Peter Hudis coming to address 5 other sections of this book, and Marcello is going to moderate, and it will be a wonderful event. And that weekend, we almost have what would be like a mini socialist scholars conference that weekend, because that event on the 21st at 1 to 3, which with as many people will probably go a little over, a part 1 of the Yale Working Group on Globalization and Culture, presenting on the state form and forming states, will be an hour after that event on the 21st. And then the very next day, they will do part 2. And Alfie Bown, who some of you may know from the UK, on Sunday, the 22nd, is going to talk about the gamification of relationships and how capital is enclosing even many aspects of our sex lives and our intimacies, etc. That will be an incredible weekend, opening up with the review and panel on the Marx Revival with Marcello's moderation.